In 1993, a young couple from Ghana paid a trafficking gang everything they had saved, hoping to reach London. The gang took their money, walked them partway across the Sahara Desert, and abandoned them there. 29 years later, their son stood on a football pitch in New Jersey, wearing the red shirt of Spain, and became a World Cup champion. Millions of people watched that final. Almost none of them knew what it took, 3 decades and 1 continent earlier, just for that family to exist inside Spain's borders at all. His name is Nico Williams, and before you know anything else about him, his speed, his goals, the moment he came off the bench to help set up the winning goal in the World Cup final against Argentina, you need to know that his entire existence is downstream of 2 people who nearly died walking through a desert with no shoes. This isn't a footnote to his career, it's the actual origin story, and almost nobody watching the World Cup final knew it was happening in front of them. To them, Nico Williams was just a 23-year-old winger from Athletic Bilbao, quick enough to torment tired defenders in extra time, disciplined enough to fit into Luis de la Fuente's suffocating defensive system, unremarkable in the sense that most elite athletes look unremarkable once you strip away the highlight reel and just see a guy doing his job well. But strip away the highlight reel on this one, and what's underneath isn't a normal football biography. It's a survival story that happened to also produce a World Cup winner, almost by accident, 3 decades later. Felix Williams and Maria Arthur left Ghana in 1993 looking for a better life. London was the destination. Family, opportunity, a fresh start. They didn't have the money for a direct route, so they paid a smuggling network for a discounted overland path instead of the usual route by sea. That decision nearly killed them. The traffickers led them on foot into the Sahara Desert and then simply left them there, stranded, with no shoes in extreme heat, hundreds of miles from anywhere. Maria was pregnant with their first son at the time. People in their group died during the crossing. They kept walking anyway, because stopping meant dying for certain, and walking only meant it was possible. They survived the desert. They were arrested at the border in Melilla, a Spanish enclave in North Africa, and a lawyer advised them to claim they were fleeing war-torn Liberia rather than Ghana, since it gave them a better chance of being allowed to stay. A Catholic priest took an interest in their case, helped them secure documents, and found them work. Therefore, a young Ghanaian couple who had planned to live in London ended up building a life in Spain instead. Not by choice, but because it was the only door that opened. Their first son, Iñaki, was born in Bilbao in June 1994, delivered into the country his parents had never intended to call home. A missionary named Iñaki Mardones, who had helped the family settle, became his godfather and gave him his first Athletic Bilbao jersey, the club that would go on to shape both Williams brothers' entire careers. Nico was born 8 years later in Pamplona on July 12, 2002. By then, Felix was working as a maintenance electrician, at one point employed at Chelsea's Stamford Bridge in London, the very city the family had been trying to reach a decade earlier, finally arriving there not as refugees, but as a father commuting to a football stadium for a day job while his sons grew up idolizing the sport a continent away. Think about the layers in that alone. A man who once crossed a desert on foot trying to reach London ends up, years later, working inside one of London's most famous football stadiums. Not as a spectator, not as a player, but as staff, fixing whatever needed fixing, invisible to the 50,000 fans walking past him on their way to their seats. He wasn't chasing football. Football just happened to be where the job was. Meanwhile, an ocean and a childhood away, his 2 sons were falling in love with the same sport for reasons that had nothing to do with their father's day job and everything to do with growing up in Bilbao, a city that treats football less like entertainment and more like religion. Here's where the story gets complicated, in a way that most immigrant success stories don't allow for. Iñaki and Nico Williams are full brothers, raised in the same house, by the same parents, shaped by the exact same desert crossing they weren't even alive for yet. And when it came time to choose which national team to represent as adults, they made different choices. Iñaki chose Ghana, the country his parents were born in, the one they were fleeing conditions in when they made that journey. Nico chose Spain, the country he was actually born and raised in, the one that took his family in after the desert nearly ended them. Neither choice was wrong. But imagine sitting across the dinner table from your own brother, knowing that on a football pitch, you now represent two different flags, two different anthems, two different histories your parents lived through in two different ways. Nico has said plainly what that entire journey meant to him. I learned what suffering is. Not abstractly, specifically from watching his parents live through the aftermath of a crossing that, statistically, plenty of people don't survive. There's a version of this story where the trauma just stays trauma, where a family that nearly lost everything in a desert stays cautious, stays small, plays it safe for the rest of their lives because the alternative once nearly killed them. That's not what happened here. Felix and Maria didn't just survive the crossing, they built something on the other side of it, in a country they never meant to end up in, and raised two sons who both became professional athletes, representing international football at the highest level that exists. Not everyone agrees on how to feel about that split either. Some football fans see choosing a national team as a question of heritage above all else, an obligation to the country your parents came from, no matter where you personally grew up. Others see it as exactly the kind of freedom immigrant families fight to give their kids in the first place. The right to decide for yourself which flag actually feels like home. The Williams brothers lived that entire debate inside one household, made two different choices, and never let it become a rift between them. There's also a quieter, harder truth sitting underneath all of this. For years, the Williams family's legal status in Spain was not guaranteed. The lie about Liberia bought them a chance, not a certainty. Families in that position spend years without knowing if the country they've built a life in will let them stay, raising children, in Nico and Iñaki's case, inside that same uncertainty, even if the boys themselves were too young to understand exactly what their parents were carrying. But surviving the desert and getting documentation was one battle. Turning two immigrant kids from Bilbao's youth academy into World Cup-level talents was a different one entirely. And it required an entire footballing infrastructure most families like theirs never get access to. Athletic Bilbao gave them that infrastructure. Famously, a club that only fields Basque-raised players, and just as famously, a club that never once treated the Williams brothers as anything other than their own. Both grew up through that academy. Both became first-team regulars. And on the night Spain won the World Cup for the second time in its history, Nico Williams came off the bench in extra time and played a direct role in the build-up to Ferran Torres' winner against Argentina. Therefore, a family that once had nothing but a desperate plan and no shoes produced a son who now has a World Cup winner's medal. That's not a metaphor, it's a literal object he can hold in his hand, earned on a pitch in New Jersey, 33 years and one ocean away from the exact spot in the Sahara where his parents nearly didn't make it. Somewhere in Ghana, Iñaki Williams was almost certainly watching that final too. Not wearing the same shirt as his brother, but carrying the same story regardless of which flag either of them plays under. Their parents' choice to survive an impossible crossing didn't just produce one football career. It produced two, on two different national teams, both of them impossible without the same two people making the same unbearable decision to keep walking. Felix and Maria Williams never set out to raise a World Cup champion. They set out to survive a desert, and then to survive being undocumented in a country they had never planned to live in. Everything else, the academy contracts, the senior debuts, the medal Nico now owns, was built on top of a foundation neither of them could have imagined they were laying down in 1993. Nico Williams' story is proof that Spain's golden generation wasn't built entirely out of academy prospects with clean, comfortable paths to the top. It was built, in part, out of families who arrived with nothing and refused to stay that way. And the man who put that entire golden generation together, who trusted immigrant kids from Bilbao and a 19-year-old from a poor neighborhood outside Barcelona over more famous names from bigger clubs, has almost the exact same kind of story himself, just told over 25 years instead of one desert crossing. He also started with nothing, in the lowest divisions of Spanish football, decades before anyone thought to call him a World Cup winning manager. That's the next video on this channel. Subscribe so you don't miss it.